My name is Arlen Westbrook, and the story I'm going to tell happened a long time ago. It was 1957. I was married to Kendall Burr, who taught at the university, taught history, and I was working in the welfare department. I got into the League of Women Voters, and somebody I met there said, oh, well, the big action now is in the NAACP, which is really doing something in the community. The League does a lot of talking, the NAACP does action, so I joined the NAACP. And what happened was that Kendall was offered a one-year appointment at Amherst College, and we owned a house on Herrick Avenue, Delmar, and we wanted to rent the house because it was a one-year appointment and move over there for a year. But there was a complication because we were moving into a building that was under construction, and it couldn't be occupied by two people until about a month after he left, after he started teaching. I was approached by a woman I knew in the NAACP, a white, I can't remember, a doctor or a lawyer, and she said, are you renting your house? I said, yes. And I think the rent was $125 a month those days, a 5-room house. And she said, there's a doctor coming to town, and he's looking for a place to rent. And I said, sure, that sounds good. And she said, but there may be a complication. This is a colored family. Would that be a problem? She said to me. And I said, well, I'll check with my husband and get back to you. And I checked with Kendall. He said, this is not Mississippi. There should be no reason for not renting to anybody. Now, this is 1956, 1957. There was no law against discrimination of any kind in this country. And actually, later I learned that there were restrictive covenants in Delmar that said you cannot sell your house to a black person, and I heard even Catholics and Jews were discriminated against in Delmar, a suburb of Albany, and but I learned that later. So not seeing any kind of problem, I said, sure, let's meet the people and see if they like the house. And so Jim and Margaret Cunningham came to the house to look it over and see whether, they had 2 daughters, Mickey, 12, and Fern, 8, to see whether the house would meet their needs. And when they came in, I saw them looking around the house. I saw Margaret looking at the artwork, and they were talking about the rental. And at that time, I had a Siamese cat, as I've always had Siamese cats. And they saw the Siamese cat, and they said, we used to have a Siamese cat. And I said, oh, nice. And then I knew right away that these people were compatible with me because they had a Siamese cat. But a complication arose. They said they wanted to move in September so the kids could start school, and our housing wouldn't be done until October. So, and they had a dog. And so, well, they seemed to like the house, we liked them. And so we said, well, if you want, you can stay here for a month so you can move to Amherst. And I'm not used to living with a lot of people, so they seemed like nice people, so we worked it out so that I stayed with them for a month. And then a question of logistics, who does the cooking? Well, not only was Margaret a great cook, international cuisine, but also she was cooking for her family, so I said, I eat everything, so I will, I'll be happy. So I paid them for the meals and so on. And then during that month, they were a very musical family, very artistic, very cultured, and we became good friends, and I hadn't thought much about renting to a black family in Delmar, or that Delmar of 12,000 people was an all-white community. And then I began to hear, what have I done? You know, what have I done? The question arose of some places in Long Island, somebody put a burning cross in somebody's yard. And then I became nervous. The Cunninghams were welcomed by the Quakers, the Unitarians, and the Methodists in this community. And I think that they did not feel any overt kinds of problems. A couple of people did speak to me. The neighbor across the street said, well, I'm selling my house, and what you've done is going to lower my property values, because that's the rumor in those days.
Do you think a Negro family moving here will affect the community as a whole?
Definitely.
In what way?
I think that, well, the property values will immediately go down if they are allowed to move in here in any number.
Actually, they sold the house for what it was appraised at, so there was no problem with that. And then somebody said, well, what about intermarriage? And I said, I mean, here I am in this house with a married couple and 2 children. I said, intermarriage? Who's getting married? Well, people get married and then they have children. And I said, well, in a mixed marriage, the children will be labeled as black, and they will be black children, and that's who they will be. So you know, I don't see that affects me at all. And then I moved back. I moved over with Kendall to Amherst and spent the time there. But I had really fun living with the Cunninghams, eating good food and listening to music and making ice cream, homemade ice cream, and et cetera, et cetera. During this time, I had always kept a journal as a way of keeping my head straight. And Margaret also was a journal keeper. Then we shared our journals with each other and put them in a file and forgot about them for 50 years. Mickey, who was very competent, pulled the 2 manuscripts together and formatted them. They were in kind of funny shapes, carbon paper, handwriting, and so on. And she coordinated this and got this book printed, Integrating Delmar, the Story of a Friendship. We had become friends. And they were having some difficulties finding a place to buy in Delmar. I mean, they ran into realtors refused to show houses to people because they were black, et cetera, et cetera. They were told, go live with the black people, you know, that kind of thing. And we didn't tell each other we were keeping journals. Everything was very secret, but we wrote our thoughts down. And what we did was, well, okay, I spent the 9 months or whatever it was at Amherst, and then the Cunninghams are still in the house. What are we going to do? Well, we knew that we all got along. So there was a period of time when we all shared this 3-bedroom house. And we had a good time. We had fun, and we became close friends. And then Margaret and I, we started talking. Well, sometimes there are barriers to relationships, and people don't talk to people for various reasons, but Margaret was a very warm and open person. And so we talked a lot about everything and shared our ideas, and we became fast friends. And that friendship lasted a lifetime, actually. And after I was living in, well, Kendall and I divorced. It was one of those young marriages that grew apart. I married Arlen Westbrook, whose name I keep today. After Perry died, I met old friend from many years ago, Marshall Clinard, a sociologist, lived 9 years in Santa Fe, and suddenly I said to myself, we had these journals, they're filed away somewhere. It's 50 years. We were part of the history of the civil rights movement. We were part of the history of Del Mar, which changed after the law came into effect. 1964, civil rights. And it's unusual to have friends for, I have friends forever, but it's unusual to keep friends forever. We vacationed together. Margaret was an artist. I'd go with her. We'd do painting together. I was very poor, and she was very good. And I was close to her children and grandchildren and so on. But I said, what we have written is part of a history of a friendship. It's part of a history of a place, part of a history of a time, and it should get into the public domain in case anyone is interested. So we came up with a Mickey. I was in Santa Fe, and I think in the end, we printed about 400 copies, and it's in the local libraries, and people bought it. We didn't do it to make money, we did it to break even. And to get this, we felt the story into the public record as part of a historical document. The covenants, I went back to when we were writing this book, I went back to, did some research in the county clerk's office to look at some deeds from that period. And I found some covenants, and they said, you cannot sell to like undesirables unless they live in your house as a servant. Well, that tells you what it was. And then I did some research on the history of restrictive covenants. There was, for example, in Seattle, you could not sell to any Asian, any Ethiopian, or any black, or any Jew, or any, there was a lot of discrimination against Chinese and Japanese people out in the West. You could not sell to them, and realtors were all, went along with this. It was part of the myth that of a fear of the other, fear of somebody that wasn't exactly a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and maybe some of that still resonates today in America. We're afraid of anybody that's a little different, but America is not. America has changed from what it used to be, which is what it's supposed to be. The melting pot is more melted than it used to be. There's a little something about my background. I grew up in a suburb of Milwaukee, of 400 people, all white, upper middle class. This high school I went to was, we had a few tokens. There was a Filipino boy there, and maybe a couple Jews, but it was a very segregated kind of upbringing. And it wasn't until I went to the University of Wisconsin that I met people from other countries or people from other races. But what happened to the Cunninghams? They did not, and Mickey knows. Well, I know this from an adult perspective. Mickey knows it from perspective as a child, but their choices at that time were where to live, Arbor Hill or the South End. These were slums with poorer schools. They were somewhat dangerous. These were segregated. And both Jim and Margaret had lived in Alaska in a integrated life with people from all races and the Eskimos and so on. And they did not want, and good schools, they did not want their children to, they wanted good opportunities that their children deserved, which Delmar could offer. A good school, a safe place to live, nice settings, trees, grass, safe, and so on. And so they decided they wanted to stay in Delmar because the kids were in school. And then when Jim got a job in Schenectady, they moved to closer to there. But they had some trouble. Well, segregation was still it when they moved out of our house on Herrick Avenue. They had some trouble finding a place to buy. They bought on Borthwick Avenue near the library. And even in Schenectady, when they moved to Schenectady, I forget what year it was, but realtors and sellers and so on sometimes were unpleasant, uncooperative. But I don't think there hasn't been a lot of overt hostility, I think, in this particular area that I know of, as there has been in places like the South and so on. I did a lot with the NAACP, but mostly on the housing committee because I felt that housing. Well, I got interested in desegregation through all of this activity, and housing is the key to integrated schools because people go to school where they live, and the key to housing is money, and the key to money is equal opportunity, and one thing leads to another, and for example, in this little development here, we have Asian families, black families, don't even think anything about it. We have parties, neighborhood parties. About this time, I was working as a volunteer, well, $1 an hour volunteer at the Arbor Hill Community Center with their arts and crafts program, and Margaret and her kids helped me with that, teach some of those arts and crafts. And that was a further integration into the black community. And we found that the public housing in Albany was segregated, which it shouldn't have been, according to law. And then, of course, the war came along, the Vietnam War came along, and I got involved in protesting against the war and so on. And then I realized that instead of getting $1,800 a year working for the county, I needed to get more education so I could get more money. So I went back to school and got an MSW and married Perry Westbrook, and he had 3 adolescent children at the time and helped raise them, and then we adopted 2 kids, a Tibetan war orphan and an American Indian. The Tibetan was 10 and the American Indian was 5. And I guess basically they were tokens in the school in Voorheesville, which might have been hard on them, but at least they had an opportunity for a good education in that school. And so life went on, but in terms of living with the Cunninghams, I didn't think much about what I was doing. It just seemed like the right thing to do and no reason not to. It wasn't any planned big campaign or big kind of effort or anything else. And the Cunninghams were exceptionally wonderful people, so it was very easy to become friends with them. And Jim was a psychiatrist, and Margaret started the Hamilton Hill Arts Center and Schenectady, which provides a lot of good service and has done very well.